Officer James Miller hated working on Sundays. The peaceful streets of Oak Grove, with their perfect lawns and expensive homes, always made him feel like he was wasting his time. But today would be different. Today would be the day that would change his life forever, though not in the way he expected. The summer sun beat down on his patrol car as he drove slowly through the neighborhood. The air conditioning wasn't working well, and his bad mood grew worse with each passing minute. He had been on the force for 15 years, and in his mind, he knew what belonged in Oak Grove and what didn't. As he turned onto Maple Street, something caught his eye. A young black teenager was riding a brand new mountain bike that must have cost at least $800. The boy wore expensive wireless headphones and carried a backpack that looked like it came from one of those high-end stores in the mall. Miller's eyes narrowed as he watched the teen pedal casually down the street. "No way this kid lives here," Miller muttered to himself, already reaching for his radio. He had seen too many robberies in his career to ignore what he considered obvious signs. The fact that it was a quiet Sunday afternoon and the boy was riding at normal speed didn't matter to Miller. His mind was already made up. Marcus Thompson was having the best day of his week. He had just finished his advanced math tutoring session at his friend Michael's house, and now he was heading home to watch the basketball game with his dad. The new bike had been a reward for getting straight A's this semester, and he loved how smooth it rode on the neighborhood streets. The music playing through his headphones, a gift from his mom for making the honor roll, was interrupted by the sound of a police siren. Just one quick blast, but it made Marcus's heart skip a beat. His father had talked to him about this many times, explaining exactly what to do if he was ever stopped by the police. "Stay calm, be respectful, and remember who you are," his dad's words echoed in his mind as he carefully pulled over to the side of the road. Marcus removed his headphones and placed both hands where they could be seen, just like his father had taught him. Officer Miller parked his patrol car at an angle, using it to block part of the street. His walk was more of a strut as he approached Marcus, one hand resting on his gun belt. The officer's face was stern, his eyes suspicious and cold. "Where did you get that bike?" Miller demanded before even reaching Marcus. His voice was loud enough that Mrs. Anderson, who was watering her flowers next door, stopped to watch. "It's mine, sir," Marcus replied politely, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I live just 3 houses down." He gestured toward his home, a beautiful 2-story house with dark blue shutters. Miller laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right, and I suppose those headphones are yours too? Let me see some ID." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his school ID in his backpack. More neighbors were starting to notice the scene. Mr. Chen from across the street had come out onto his porch. Sarah Martinez, out jogging with her golden retriever, had stopped and pulled out her phone. "Sir, I can explain everything," Marcus said, his voice still calm despite his racing heart. He could feel his throat getting tight, but he remembered his father's words about staying composed. "If you just let me." "Out of the backpack, now," Miller ordered, cutting him off. "Hands where I can see them at all times." The officer's face was getting red, his patience wearing thin with what he saw as attitude from a suspicious person in his patrol area. Marcus slowly got off his bike, his legs feeling weak. This was the moment he had been prepared for but had hoped would never come. As he carefully set his backpack down, he could see Mrs. Anderson on her phone, probably calling the police station. She had been to many of his family's barbecues and knew exactly who he was. The situation was about to take a turn that Officer Miller never saw coming, and the quiet Sunday afternoon in Oak Grove would never be forgotten by anyone who witnessed what happened next. Officer Miller circled Marcus like a shark, his boots scraping against the hot pavement. The teenager's school ID card was now in Miller's hand, but he barely glanced at it. In his mind, he had already decided what was happening here, another case of a young troublemaker where he didn't belong. "So, Marcus Thompson," Miller said, drawing out each syllable, "you expect me to believe you live in one of these houses?" He gestured to the expensive homes lining the street, his tone dripping with disbelief. Marcus took a deep breath, just like his father had taught him. He could feel his phone buzzing in his pocket, probably his dad wondering why he wasn't home yet, but he didn't dare reach for it. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied calmly. "The blue house with the basketball hoop. Number 1242. We've lived there for 3 years." His voice remained steady, though his heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. More neighbors had gathered now. Mrs. Anderson was still on her phone, speaking urgently to someone. Mr. Chen had walked closer, his arms crossed and his face worried. The Martinez family had come out onto their lawn, and their daughter Sarah was still recording everything on her phone. "Empty the backpack," Miller ordered, ignoring the growing crowd. "Slowly, and keep those hands where I can see them." Marcus carefully unzipped his backpack. Out came his math textbook, calculator, and notebook filled with advanced algebra problems. Each item he placed carefully on the ground, knowing one wrong move could make things worse. "That's an expensive calculator," Miller said, picking up the graphing calculator his mom had bought him for his advanced math classes. "Where'd you get this?" "It was a gift from my mother, sir. For making the honor roll." Marcus could feel tears forming in his eyes, but he blinked them back. He wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. Mrs. Anderson had walked closer now. "Officer, I can vouch for this young man. He lives." "Ma'am, please step back," Miller interrupted sharply. "This is a police matter." The situation was getting worse. Miller had moved his hand to his handcuffs, the metal glinting in the afternoon sun. Marcus could feel the fear rising in his throat, but his father's training kept him focused. "Stay calm. Think clearly. Remember who you are." "Sir," Marcus tried again, "if you could just call the station and verify." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller ordered, cutting him off. "You match the description of a suspect in several recent burglaries." Marcus knew this wasn't true. There hadn't been any burglaries in Oak Grove for months. His father would have told him, would have warned him to be extra careful if there had been. As Miller roughly grabbed Marcus's wrist, Mrs. Anderson shouted, "This is ridiculous. That's Chief Thompson's son." But Miller wasn't listening. The handcuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists, cold and tight. The teenager could hear gasps from the growing crowd of neighbors. Someone said they were calling the mayor. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this. His father had always taught him to handle situations on his own merit, to never use his dad's position for special treatment. But now, handcuffed on his own street, Marcus knew he had no choice. "Officer Miller," he said quietly but clearly, making sure his words would be heard by everyone present. "My father is Police Chief David Thompson, your boss." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Miller's hands, which had been checking the handcuffs, suddenly froze. The crowd went silent. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. In that moment of perfect stillness, they'd all heard the sound of tires squealing around the corner. A black SUV with police department plates was racing toward them, and Marcus knew exactly who was behind the wheel. The confrontation was about to reach its breaking point, and Officer James Miller's world was about to turn upside down. The black SUV screeched to a halt, leaving tire marks on the perfect streets of Oak Grove. Chief David Thompson stepped out, and the atmosphere changed instantly. He was still wearing his Sunday casual clothes, a polo shirt and khakis, but his presence commanded attention like he was in full uniform. Officer Miller's face had turned ghost white. His hands, still gripping Marcus's handcuffed wrists, began to shake. The chief's son. He had just handcuffed the chief's son. Chief Thompson took in the scene with one sweep of his trained eyes. His son in handcuffs, the scattered contents of the backpack on the ground. The crowd of neighbors with their phones recording everything, and Officer Miller looking like he had just seen a ghost. "Officer Miller," Chief Thompson's voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "Remove those handcuffs from my son. Now." Miller fumbled with the keys, his usually steady hands trembling as he unlocked the handcuffs. Marcus rubbed his wrists but stayed quiet, watching his father handle the situation. "Sir, I didn't know he was your," Miller started to explain. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Chief Thompson cut him off. "Would it have made a difference if he wasn't my son? Would you have treated any other innocent teenager this way?" The neighbors had gone silent, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Anderson stepped forward, her phone still recording. "Chief Thompson, I called the station as soon as I saw what was happening. This officer wouldn't listen when I tried to tell him who Marcus was." Chief Thompson nodded, thanking her with a gentle smile. Then he turned back to Miller, his expression hardening. "Give me your badge and gun, Officer Miller." "Sir, please." Miller's voice cracked. "I was just following protocol. There have been reports of." "No, Officer Miller, you weren't following protocol. Chief Thompson's voice remained steady but grew colder. Protocol doesn't involve harassing a teenager for riding his bike home. Protocol doesn't mean ignoring witnesses who try to verify someone's identity. And protocol certainly doesn't mean handcuffing a minor without probable cause. Marcus began picking up his books and calculator from the ground. Sarah Martinez, still recording everything, came over to help him. Other neighbors moved closer, offering support and sharing what they had witnessed. Chief, Miller tried one last time. I can explain. Oh, you'll explain, Chief Thompson assured him. You'll explain to Internal Affairs, you'll explain to the review board, and you'll explain to every officer in this department why we're about to have mandatory retraining on racial bias. Miller's hands shook as he removed his badge and gun, placing them in his chief's outstretched hand. The crowd of neighbors murmured their approval. Mr. Chen, Chief Thompson called out to the neighbor who had been watching since the beginning. Would you mind giving Officer Miller a ride back to the station? I'll have someone pick up his patrol car later. Mr. Chen nodded firmly. Of course, Chief. Happy to help. As Miller walked away with Mr. Chen, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Chief Thompson finally turned to his son. The chief's stern expression melted into concern. You okay, son? Marcus nodded, trying to stay strong but feeling the emotion of the moment. Yes, sir. I did everything you taught me. Stayed calm, spoke clearly, kept my hands visible. Chief Thompson pulled his son into a tight hug, not caring who saw. The neighbors watching felt the power of the moment. A father holding his son, a black police chief showing both strength and tenderness. You did good, Marcus, Chief Thompson whispered. But I'm so sorry you had to go through this. This is exactly why I took this job. This is why we keep working for change. As father and son walked to the SUV together, the neighbors began to disperse. Mrs. Anderson was already sharing her video with local news stations. Sarah Martinez was posting her recording on social media. Mr. Chen would later file a detailed witness statement. This quiet Sunday afternoon in Oak Grove would become a turning point, not just for Officer Miller or the Thompson family, but for the entire police department. The real work was just beginning. By Monday morning, the videos were everywhere. Local news stations played the footage of Marcus in handcuffs on repeat. Social media exploded with posts showing Officer Miller's confrontation with Chief Thompson's son. The quiet neighborhood of Oak Grove had become the center of a storm. Officer James Miller sat alone in his small apartment, staring at his silent phone. His fellow officers hadn't called or texted since yesterday. The morning news played quietly on his TV, showing his face next to headlines about racial profiling. His coffee had gone cold, untouched on the table. And in breaking news, the TV announcer said, the Oak Grove Police Department has scheduled a press conference for this afternoon regarding yesterday's incident involving Officer James Miller and the police chief's son. Miller switched off the TV. His hands were shaking again, just like they had been when Chief Thompson took his badge. 20 years of police work, and now everything was falling apart because of one Sunday afternoon. Meanwhile, at Oak Grove High School, Marcus walked through the hallways with his head held high. Students and teachers stopped to watch him pass. Some offered words of support, while others just stared. His best friend Michael walked beside him, acting like a shield against all the attention. Everyone's seen the video, Michael whispered as they headed to first period. Sarah's post got shared like 50,000 times. Marcus nodded but kept walking. His father had helped him prepare for this day, knowing the attention would be intense. Just focus on your classes, Chief Thompson had told him that morning. Let me handle everything else. In the police station, Chief Thompson sat in his office, reviewing the growing stack of emails and messages on his desk. Mrs. Anderson had sent a detailed witness statement. The mayor had called 3 times. Civil rights organizations were demanding action. Even national news networks were requesting interviews. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Lieutenant Garcia, his most trusted officer, entered with a thick folder. Sir, we've pulled Miller's entire service record. You need to see this. Chief Thompson opened the folder and started reading. His expression grew darker with each page. There were previous complaints about Miller's behavior. Nothing this serious, but a pattern was emerging. Reports of being aggressive during stops. Comments about his attitude toward minority residents. All the warning signs had been there. How did these complaints get buried? Chief Thompson asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Lieutenant Garcia shook her head. The old chief, he had a different way of handling things. A lot of complaints never made it to the official record. Across town, in the local coffee shop, Mrs. Anderson sat with other neighbors who had witnessed the incident. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages from reporters seeking interviews. I always knew something wasn't right about that officer, Mrs. Anderson said, stirring her tea. The way he'd slow down and stare at certain people walking through the neighborhood. Sarah Martinez, still in her jogging clothes from her morning run, nodded in agreement. My dad said he got stopped by Miller twice last month, just for walking our dog in the evening. Back at the police station, Chief Thompson stood up from his desk. It was almost time for the press conference. He straightened his uniform and looked at the speech his secretary had prepared. But he knew he wouldn't use it. This moment required something more personal, more real. As he walked toward the conference room, officers stood aside, watching their chief with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. They all knew changes were coming. Big changes. Chief Thompson paused outside the conference room door. Through the window, he could see the crowd of reporters setting up their cameras. This wasn't just about his son anymore. This wasn't even just about Officer Miller. This was about every Marcus out there, every kid who looked suspicious just because of their skin color. He took a deep breath and reached for the door handle. It was time to turn this incident into something more than just another viral video. It was time for real change. The police station's conference room had never been so crowded. Reporters packed the space shoulder to shoulder, the cameras pointed at the empty podium. Local news stations had set up their equipment, and phones were ready to live stream everything. The room buzzed with whispered conversations and the soft click of camera shutters. At exactly 2:00 p.m., Chief David Thompson walked in. The room fell silent. He wore his full-dress uniform, every button polished, every badge gleaming. But it wasn't his uniform that commanded attention. It was the look in his eyes. To everyone's surprise, Marcus walked in behind his father. He wore his school uniform, having come straight from class. Some reporters started shouting questions immediately, but Chief Thompson raised his hand for silence. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice firm and clear. "Yesterday, an incident occurred in Oak Grove that has gained national attention. My son, Marcus Thompson, was wrongfully detained by one of our officers while riding his bike home from a study session." Camera flashes filled the room. Marcus stood tall beside his father, just as they had practiced at home. "But I'm not here as Marcus's father today," Chief Thompson continued. "I'm here as your chief of police, and what happened yesterday wasn't just about my son. It's about every son, every daughter, every person who has ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character." In his apartment, Officer Miller watched the press conference on TV. His hands gripped his coffee mug tightly as his boss, the man whose son he had handcuffed, addressed the nation. Back at the station, Chief Thompson gestured to Marcus. "My son did everything right. He was polite. He was respectful. He followed every instruction. And he was still handcuffed on his own street, in his own neighborhood, for nothing more than being black in America." Mrs. Anderson and several other neighbors watched from the back of the room. They had been invited as witnesses. Sarah Martinez held up her phone, recording this moment just as she had recorded the incident. "Officer Miller has been placed on administrative leave," Chief Thompson announced. "But this isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that needs to change. Starting today, our department will implement new training programs. We will review every complaint filed in the past 5 years. We will create a civilian oversight committee." Marcus watched his father with pride. This was why people respected Chief Thompson. He didn't just talk about problems, he solved them. To every parent who has ever had to teach their child how to survive a police encounter, Chief Thompson's voice grew emotional. "I share your pain. As a police chief, I work to protect our community. As a black father, I live in fear for my son. These two realities cannot continue to exist together." Reporters raised their hands, eager to ask questions. But Chief Thompson wasn't finished. "Marcus," he turned to his son, "would you like to say something?" Marcus stepped forward to the podium. The room went completely quiet. Even the camera shutters stopped clicking. "Yesterday was scary," Marcus said simply. "But my father taught me to be strong. He taught me to be proud of who I am, and he taught me that change happens when good people stand up and say, "This isn't right." In his apartment, Officer Miller set down his coffee mug with trembling hands. For the first time, he saw Marcus not as a suspect, but as a brave young man. He saw Chief Thompson not just as his boss, but as a father protecting his son. And he saw himself through new eyes, eyes that made him ashamed. Back at the press conference, Chief Thompson wrapped his arm around his son's shoulders. "We will be taking questions now," he announced. "But remember, this isn't just a news story. This is about real people, real lives, and real change. And that change starts today." The reporters raised their hands, but the real story wasn't in their questions. It was in the determined look shared between father and son, in the tears in Mrs. Anderson's eyes, and in the hope that filled the room. Change was coming to Oak Grove, and nothing would ever be the same. 1 week after the press conference, the Oak Grove Police Department looked different. The usual morning briefing room had been transformed into a training center. Charts about racial bias hung on the walls. New instructors from the State Police Academy stood at the front, ready to begin their sessions. Chief Thompson walked through the rows of seated officers. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed eager to learn. In the back corner, Officer Miller sat alone, wearing civilian clothes. After many discussions with the review board, he had been given a choice: complete the new training program or resign. Today, Chief Thompson addressed the room. "We start fresh. We learn to see our biases. We learn to be better." His eyes met Miller's for a moment. "We all have a choice to grow or to stay the same." In another part of town, Marcus sat in his school library with a group of students. After his speech at the press conference, many of his classmates had approached him with their own stories. Now, they were forming a student organization called Bridge the Gap to help improve relationships between teens and police. "My dad got stopped 3 times last month," a Latino student named Carlos shared, "just for jogging in the evening." "That happened to my brother too," added Jenny, an Asian American student. "Yet officers always said he looked suspicious." Marcus wrote down their stories. These would become part of the training materials for the police department. Real stories from real kids in their community. Back at the station, the training session was intense. The instructors showed videos of police interactions gone wrong. They presented research about unconscious bias. But the most powerful moment came when they played the video of Marcus's arrest. Officer Miller watched himself on the screen, saw his aggressive approach, heard his dismissive tone. The room was silent except for the video audio. When it ended, Miller stood up. "Chief Thompson," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "May I say something?" The chief nodded, curious about what Miller would say. "I've been a cop for 20 years, Miller began. And watching that video, I didn't recognize myself, or maybe I finally saw myself clearly for the first time." He turned to face his fellow officers. "We talk about protecting and serving, but who are we protecting when we act like that? Who are we serving when we let our biases control us?" The room stayed quiet, but heads nodded. Other officers began sharing their own experiences, times they might have acted on bias without realizing it. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Mrs. Anderson and other community members were meeting with the mayor. They were forming the new civilian oversight committee that Chief Thompson had promised. "We need regular people on this committee," Mrs. Anderson insisted. "People who live in every neighborhood, people of all backgrounds." The mayor agreed. The old way of doing things, keeping problems quiet and hoping they would go away, was over. Back in the training room, the afternoon session focused on practical changes: new protocols for stops and searches, better communication techniques, ways to de-escalate situations before they became confrontations. Officer Miller took detailed notes. Each new procedure made him think of how differently things could have gone that Sunday with Marcus. How a simple conversation could have replaced handcuffs. How listening to Mrs. Anderson could have prevented everything. At the end of the day, Chief Thompson called Miller into his office. The chief's desk was covered with applications, people from all backgrounds wanting to join the reform department. "James," the chief said, using Miller's first name for the first time, "I saw you participating today, really participating, not just going through the motions." Miller nodded. "I want to learn, sir. I want to be better." "Good," Chief Thompson replied, "because starting next week, after you complete this training, you're going to help teach it to other departments. Your story, your journey, might help other officers change too. Outside the station, the sun was setting on Oak Grove. Change was happening, slowly but surely. It wasn't always comfortable, and it wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. And it was working. 3 months after the incident, Officer James Miller stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his uniform. His badge, returned to him last week, shined brightly against the dark blue fabric. But it felt different now, heavier, more meaningful. Today would be his first day back on regular patrol, but first, he had somewhere important to go. The Thompson house waited for him, its blue shutters and basketball hoop exactly as he remembered from that Sunday afternoon. Marcus was shooting baskets in the driveway when Miller's car pulled up. The teenager caught the ball and held it, watching as the officer stepped out. Chief Thompson appeared in the doorway, having taken the morning off for this meeting. "Good morning, Officer Miller," Marcus said politely, but without fear this time. The 3 months of changes had affected everyone. Inside the house, Mrs. Thompson had prepared coffee and cookies. Family photos covered the walls. Marcus as a baby, his first day of school, Chief Thompson's graduation from the police academy. Miller looked at these pictures and saw what he had missed before. Not a suspicious teenager, but a loved and cherished son. "I practiced this speech 100 times," Miller began, this coffee untouched. "But now that I'm here, the words don't seem enough." "Take your time," Chief Thompson said quietly. His wife sat beside him, holding his hand. "Marcus," Miller turned to the teenager, "what I did that day was wrong. Not just because you're the chief's son, but because no one deserves to be treated that way. I let my biases control my actions. I saw your skin color instead of seeing you." Marcus nodded, listening carefully. The basketball sat in his lap, his hands resting on it calmly. "These past months," Miller continued, "I've learned so much. About myself, about my prejudices, about the real meaning of protect and serve. The training helped, but what really changed me was watching that video of myself, seeing how I acted, hearing my own voice." Mrs. Thompson wiped a tear from her eye. Her son had gone through something no child should experience, but here they were, turning pain into progress. "The hardest part," Miller admitted, "was accepting that I wasn't the officer I thought I was. I told myself I was one of the good ones, that I treated everyone fairly, but I didn't. And I'm sorry, truly sorry." Chief Thompson leaned forward. "James, apologies are important, but what matters more is change, real, lasting change." "That's why I'm here," Miller replied. "I want to join Marcus's Bridge the Gap program, if he'll have me. I want to help other officers learn what I've learned. I want to be part of the solution." Marcus looked surprised. The program had grown bigger than he expected, with regular meetings between teens and police officers. But having Officer Miller involved would add something powerful, a real story of transformation. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that could be really good. Other officers might listen to someone who's been through it themselves." Mrs. Thompson brought more coffee. The conversation shifted, becoming more natural. They talked about Marcus's basketball team, about the changes at the department, about the new Civilian Oversight Committee's first meetings. As Miller prepared to leave for his patrol shift, Chief Thompson walked him to the door. "You know, James, some officers quit rather than go through the training. They couldn't face their own biases. But you stayed. You learned. That matters." Outside, Marcus was back to shooting baskets. Miller watched him for a moment, remembering that Sunday, the same boy, the same driveway, but everything else had changed. "Hey, Marcus," Miller called out, "maybe sometime you could teach me that jump shot." Marcus grinned. "Sure, Officer Miller. But fair warning, I won't go easy on you." As Miller drove away, headed for his first patrol since the incident, he felt different. His badge felt different. His whole world felt different. And that, he realized, was exactly how it should be. 6 months after that life-changing Sunday afternoon, the Oak Grove High School auditorium was packed. Students, parents, police officers, and community members filled every seat. On stage, a banner read "Bridge the Gap, Community Unity Conference." Marcus Thompson stood at the podium, looking confident in his dark blue suit. Next to him, Officer James Miller waited for his turn to speak. In the front row, Chief Thompson and his wife sat with proud smiles on their faces. "When I started Bridge the Gap," Marcus began. "I thought it would just be a small group of students sharing their stories. But look at us now." He gestured to the crowded room. "We have over 20 police departments here today, learning from our program." The audience applauded. Among them sat Mrs. Anderson and Sarah Martinez, who had witnessed everything that started this movement. Their videos had helped spark change, but what happened after was even more important. "And now," Marcus continued, "I'd like to introduce someone special. 6 months ago, he was the officer who put handcuffs on me. Today, he's one of our strongest supporters and a leader in police reform. Please welcome Officer James Miller." The applause was genuine as Miller stepped up to the podium. He looked different now, more humble, more human. His badge still shined, but now it represented something new. "My name is James Miller," he began, "and I was wrong." His voice carried clearly through the auditorium. "I was wrong about Marcus. I was wrong about a lot of things. But thanks to Chief Thompson and the whole Oak Grove community, I got a chance to learn from my mistakes." In the audience, other police officers nodded. Many of them had gone through the new training program that Miller now helped teach. Some had faced their own biases and made their own changes. Today, Miller continued, "Our department looks different. We have new officers from all backgrounds. Our civilian oversight committee holds us accountable. But most importantly, we're building real relationships with our community." He turned to Marcus. "This same man taught me something important. It's not enough to say we're not racist. We have to actively work to be better, to do better, every single day." The presentation continued with videos showing the changes in Oak Grove. Crime rates hadn't gone up with the new policies. They had actually gone down. Community trust had improved. Other cities were starting to copy their programs. After the formal presentation, people gathered in small groups to talk. Officer Miller stood with a group of teenagers, listening to their experiences. Chief Thompson watched from across the room, seeing how natural these conversations had become. "Dad." Marcus approached his father. "The mayor of Central City wants to start Bridge the Gap in their schools. They want me to help set it up." Chief Thompson smiled. His son had grown so much through all of this. "I'm proud of you, Marcus. You turned a bad situation into something good for everyone." Near the refreshment table, Mrs. Anderson talked with some new police recruits. "I remember when we couldn't even walk through our own neighborhoods without being stopped," she said. "Now look at us, planning community events together." As the evening wound down, Marcus and Officer Miller stood outside the auditorium, watching people leave. The sunset painted the sky in beautiful colors, just like that Sunday afternoon 6 months ago. "You know," Miller said, "I almost quit the force after what happened. I couldn't face what I'd done." Marcus bounced his basketball. He still carried one everywhere. "I'm glad you stayed. It's easy to run away. It's harder to stay and make things better." Inside, Chief Thompson was collecting contact information from other police departments interested in their programs. His phone kept buzzing with messages from across the country. Everyone wanted to know how Oak Grove had made such big changes work. As the last people left the auditorium, Marcus took one final shot with his basketball. Officer Miller caught the rebound, and for a moment, they were just a teenager and an officer playing basketball on a beautiful evening. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. In Oak Grove, they started with a boy on a bike and an officer who made a mistake, but they ended with something much bigger. A community that learned to see each other, hear each other, and grow together.